Okay, I think we're gonna get started. All right, thank you guys coming through here. Just okay. Yeah, no problem. You're lost and now you're found. Okay, so we'll continue on with our topic on communication. Remember, we're going through the 10 laws of communication. So today we're going to cover the last 4 laws of communication. And I'm hoping that today one of our case studies is going to be a little bit longer, just to be able to tie up all the things that we've learned in the past sessions and in today's sessions to really be able to formulate something close to a nice, complete lesson plan or presentation. So that'll be one of the goals for today, halfway during. And then at the end, we're going to finish with the final 2 laws, which are simpler, more logical, and wrap it up for this course. So today we're going to be starting off on the law of substance. Okay. So I don't know if you guys could read that. To be understood by another person, one must not authorize validity to the very prospect of invalidation, which has the potential to assume its own assumption of deficiency within very milieu of the message. So the bottom line of this cartoon is supposed to be funny, is just to have clear communication and clear substance. So now that we have, sorry, one second here. Now that we have gone through the skeleton, okay, of having a statement of intent, having a statement of proposition, so on and so forth. Now we're really going to add some real substance, okay, to our lesson plan. So what are some of the first things that we need to do is have a title, okay? So some thoughts of having this title is you got to think, are you going to be advertising it to different people? Is this title going to be posted on bulletin boards? Is it going to be on the church website? So you want to give some thought into your title. So a few tips that they talk about is you don't want a title to be overly long, okay? So you want to have a short title with about, ideally you want to aim for a title of about 5 words or less. And an example, a helpful tip is to add a subtitle to that if you wanted to elaborate a little bit on the topic. A few things that they sort of, the textbook really emphasizes is to avoid using Christian jargon. So an example he uses here, if your title is going to talk about redemption for sinners, instead try a title like forgiveness for all, for example. So you want to keep in mind a lot of tips we talk about here, they may not necessarily apply, let's say, to your lesson plan on a weekly basis, educating youth. But these are all good tips as you kind of get more experience. And if you're asked to give topics to, let's say, a whole class, for example, or a whole grade, I should say, or you're going to give, speaking to servants meeting and that sort of thing. So these are some tips to be applied to that. So just you want to keep in mind, these are sort of lifelong communication that apply to you as a Sunday school teacher every Friday, for example, but they're good tips to have in general when you're speaking to smaller groups. And keep that in mind for, for really all of the things that are taught about in this communication course, especially in this section here. Another tip the author talks, instead of saying overcoming bad habits, try changing for the good. So some tips in, give some thought in your title, make sure important is when you start with confidence, it could really set the tone for the rest of your talk or rest of your presentation. Accessibility. When you go up hiding behind the pulpit or you're not very open, you're not creating an environment of warmth, that could all of a sudden, people could tune out early on. So you want to keep that in mind. Vulnerability. One tip that he talked about is when you open up with a story about yourself or open up about a personal experience, something that you may be struggling through, already open up the channel between you and your audience. You want to arouse interest, okay? So he talks about here how oftentimes we open up with a Sunday school lesson with a Bible verse, which, obviously the Bible is the foundation of everything that we do, but that might not arouse interest right away, right? You want to start something a little interesting at first to arouse their interest, and then, once you've not lured them in, but grabbed everybody's attention, you could use a Bible verse. That could be very, at that time, that would be an appropriate time. To command attention, something that will jolt them out of their thoughts of the week. You want to keep in mind, especially if you're going to go on to teach high school, they've had a long week. When they come Friday, they're usually not primed for learning right away, right? They want to talk with their friends, they want to joke around, they want to have a good time. So getting them out of that, getting them out of that mode to be attracted to listen to something and be in learning mode can be a challenge sometimes. So you want to keep that in mind. To reveal the need, and we talked about this last week. To reveal a need, to tell them, you guys, you will need this. This is something important to you. This is something that you don't have. And the author, talks about how salespeople often use this by revealing a need. However, he says we're not exactly salesmen, right? So we're making people aware of their sense of the need. We're revealing it to them. We're not creating one. We're not trying to sell snow to an Eskimo here or somebody up north. We're revealing that there is a need, and what we're about to speak about is something that's going to be important for them. To state a purpose. Okay, so these are all purposes of a good introduction and a good title, okay? So you want to state what you're going to be talking about. So after you reveal the need, so for example, you say there's not a person who hasn't struggled with temptation. Okay, so you reveal a need, and then you go on to say, today I will help us to discover some key points in overcoming temptation. Okay, so you reveal the need, you capture their attention, and then you lay out the plan. This is the purpose of today. This is what we're going to be talking about. Talks about the length of an introduction. Okay, so it's important that the introduction is they call it, he likens it to an appetizer, right? Your introduction is not the whole lesson. You're just introducing what you're talking about, giving everybody an idea of what you're going to be talking about. Don't be too long. So this is a very important tip I hope everybody could use in their next introduction, okay? So listen carefully. Always start your presentation with a joke, but be careful not to offend anyone, okay? Don't mention religion, politics, race, age, money, technology, men, women, children, plants, food, and animals. All right, so keep that in mind. Yeah, you're a little confused? It's a joke. It's not meant to be. Okay, nobody else is finding that funny. I know it's Sunday afternoon, guys, but I find these jokes funny, but anyways. Pardon me? Exactly, everybody gets offended. So they're giving you a tip to use a joke, but like not really, because everyone gets offended these days. So what are the different contents of introductions? What can you use in your introductions to vary things up? So some of the examples is a simple illustration, okay? Here he uses a biblical example of St. Paul when he talks about how, he mentions in Acts, I saw your many altars, and one of them had an inscription on it to an unknown God. So he uses there an example of, hey, he's preaching to the people saying, I saw one of your altars, a real illustration for them. So something that we can do in our day now is, for example, sorry, I'm just going to move from now. Is using a modern day example, like an article. In the past, we've had case studies with articles, or using something that's happened in the news. when you use something that's happened in the news or an article or a big game that's coming up, you automatically capture everybody's attention, right? Because it's something they're all aware of. And then once you capture that, you could lead to the lesson that you want to speak about. A striking statement, you want to say something that's going to really grab their attention. He uses example here in Luke where he says, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees, beware of their hypocrisies. So immediately here, Jesus is using a striking statement to say his point and say what he was about to say. An intriguing question. In Mark, it says, how can Satan cast out Satan? So, and again, another biblical example of how using an intriguing question can help with your introduction. A familiar proverb or quotation. Another one here, he uses an example of Jesus in the Gospel of St. Matthew, using a familiar proverb to really get everybody's attention. A dramatic action, okay? He uses an example here of when Jesus was in the synagogue and went to read the scrolls and he sat down. And that created a dramatic action in the synagogue and everybody was wondering what happened or what happened there. So something that you can apply in your lessons, whether it be through a role play or do something specific, that can help do that. I remember one time in my grade 10 history class, my history teacher comes up to me and he tells me, I was sitting at the front. He's like, I'm going to give you this ruler. And whatever you do, don't give this ruler to anybody. So he gives me this ruler and I hang on to it. And then he's going around, saying his history lesson. He's walking around. And then 10 minutes later, obviously, like I'm relaxed, I'm not holding on to the ruler, comes in and grabs the ruler. And the whole point of the history lesson was how great, great empires are very observant and very protective of the walls, and over time they get lazy and lackadaisical, and then they give up all the security, or they kind of tone down their security levels, and therefore they're more susceptible to being invaded. So he took my ruler because I was kind of relaxed. Anyways, that was a dramatic action that my history teacher used, something we can all learn from. The value of story. So it's this or seen it or use a good valuable story to illustrate a nice example here. And again, what I really love about this text, it uses a lot of really good biblical examples. So for here, it talks about an example in Prophet Nathan came to David to tell him of a story. He says, David, I have a story to tell you. A rich man and a poor man, okay? This poor man had just this one lamb that he cared for very much. One time when the rich man had a visitor, he took the poor man's lamb. It's like, how dare he do that? And he got very emotional. And he's like, this is what you did when you took your servant's wife and killed the servant. We all know the famous story. So David got so passionate about a story when he did the same thing for himself. So the example here is sometimes a story can really reveal something, can really connect with us in a different way and can be quite effective. It can cut through a person's defenses sometimes. Story is very important to explore a point, okay? It can also be very helpful in assisting in recall, right? A lot of times they might just leave your lesson with that one story. It really hit home to them, and they'll associate the point of the whole lesson with that one story. And that's an easy way for them to remember or take home the message that you told them about. The source of stories. A good tip here is to keep a record of all your stories. And I actually do this myself. So you just have a Word document that you just, anytime you see a story, copy and paste, because good stories are hard to come by. So keep a good stories that have a good themes or good morals. And sometimes it could be, true stories, or sometimes you're not sure, but they sound good anyways. So that's a good tip to kind of keep in mind. It's keeping a record of stories. You can use sometimes your own personal stories of own challenges that you had. So you want to keep that in mind as well. Obviously, the Bible narrative has a lot of wonderful stories that you can use. And one final tip here is to use some imagination and create your own stories. Some of the characteristics of good stories are, is it appropriate in length? So this is an important one. A lot of times you come across these wonderful stories, but they're 2 pages long. And unless you're going to base the whole lesson on that and really do a study of that one specific lesson, it's not appropriate to be part of your lesson or part of your introduction. So you want to see how appropriate it is. It has to be, it can't be too long, or else you're just going to lose attention of people. It has to be succinct and to the point. So briefness is the second point, and appropriate is appropriate to the specific topic that you're talking about. So A, B, and C, is it climactic? Okay. Is it direct? Does it get to the point? Does it invoke emotion? And you'll realize that all good stories invoke some sort of emotion, whether it's a funny emotion, whether it's a sad emotion. That's really where the hook is sometimes. So that's how people remember these stories. So we talked about this earlier. Using illustrations can provide an important sort of aspect of creating substance. So that can be a brief account of an event, a quote that causes people to stop. Okay, quotes are often used. A joke that builds rapport, a fact or a statistics or an audio visual, and so on and so forth. Resources as you can to kind of widen your horizon and thinking, and what else can I bring to the lesson to really drive home the point. The author warns of what he calls traps of reversal. And I think this is an important point to keep in mind. So what he refers to that here is, it's important we're not finding an illustration, like we don't start with an illustration. Oh, this is a Bible story or a Bible theme or a lesson that can help support this illustration. Okay, it's always the other way around. You have a lesson, you're given a lesson, you're given a topic, a biblical. So it's important not to do the same way around. Okay, and the same thing with the second trap. And the third one is, oftentimes we get carried away with the story that's really nice and that's really funny, but doesn't really apply to what we're saying. We just want to say something that entertaining, that we will be. So just beware not to fall into that trap and just keep to that talking about. Now the author goes on to how to create questions that create insight when leading Bible studies. So now we've talked about sort of substance and introduction and that sort of thing. Now, if you're leading a Bible study, which is another sort of format, what type of questions can you use or can you ask? So keep in mind, the questions that you ask and how you ask them can really help dictate good conversation, okay, in your class. So instead of keeping it open, just always open-ended, try to be as specific as you can, as relevant as you can with the question. It can really help encourage good dialogue. So some tips here is, ask relevant questions. Okay, so questions that cause them to reflect on their life. Ask for opinions. This is very important. Ask open-ended questions. So you could allow them to kind of to say how they feel. Ask questions that create tension. Ask questions creatively, so using case studies or illustrations. Ask questions that encourage reflection, and to ask pointed questions. Further, you can ask questions that encourage depth and questions that allow for a breadth of response. So it's sometimes not just one response, and conclude by how you can might be able to put some of these into practice. Some teaching strategies that can create interest. Again, we talked about storytelling, okay, poems, newspaper articles. Remember to use all these tips when you're giving a lesson. An interesting thing about music, I remember one time when I was teaching Sunday school lesson years ago to high school, and I had like it was a hymn, or it was like a Christian song, and I played it as part of the lesson. And we talked about last session about there's certain audio visual learners who really connect with that way. And that song, that hymn really touched this one student who came after me. He's like, that was a really beautiful hymn. So don't underestimate that in using those modes in your lesson. It can be quite effective. It's not just something on paper. It's actually can have quite an impact. Picture, so study a cartoon, all the wonderful pictures that I have for you guys today. Video, audio, as well as aids. Well, so things like brainstorm, and have people prepare for debate. To debate my daughter, who's in grade 4, she had to present friends and prevent and even more at the high school. sit up in the bow, and that is where you're kind of have them think, oh, okay, all these points make sense. Now I'm going to change my thought process. I am convinced of what was said. And that is why the conclusion is very important. And so we draw together all the points and synthesizing it into one single point. And if you go back last session, I don't know how, I know there's a lot of people who signed online, joined online, but when we talked about the statement of intent, this is sort of the idea, is you have all these points, you conclude it nicely, leading back to your statement of intent. So you keep your point nice and clear. The conclusion can also stir the emotions through inspiration. And here it talks about how it challenges the location, okay? So the will is the seat of decision making, and it's influenced by reason and emotion, but this is what helps us make decisions. So the idea here, a good conclusion will help us change our will and really move the will, move our emotions to kind of move towards the message that being sent and create an action in us. And that's why it's quite important. The conclusion should be precise, and insistent, should be clear and pertinent, short and timely. So as mentioned before, it should be a summary of your key points, ties together everything in a logical way, and it clarifies between content and personal implications of what has been covered. So the idea is, a lot of times, if you're seeing a lot of examples in your conclusion, you want to always bring it back to say, these are the examples I said, and that's the reason why, because it leads to my points. So you want to always go back to the point, to your statement of intent. You can use a story as a reminder, or a rhetorical question, and close in prayer. Some of the mistakes of conclusions. So things you should not do in a conclusion: introducing new material. Okay, so don't do that. You have your points, you prepared well, your introduction, your statements of preposition and elaboration. Just conclude everything you've talked about. Don't introduce anything new. Here it talks about stopping before you have finished. So you want to give your, again, conclusion some substance, and not just a one-liner. It can kind of keep people hanging off the ledge a little bit. So you want to give it some substance to wrap it up nicely. Talks about lack of variety, so you want to try to change it up a little bit. Don't have confrontation in your conclusion. So we want to try to be positive and encourage people to leave inspired, as opposed to feeling down and depressed and something hanging over them. So be positive, message of hope in your conclusion, as opposed to being confrontational. Next, we'll talk about making communication meaningful. So for our communication to be memorable, it must be both meaningful and moving. So we talk a little bit here about understanding information and ways, again, we process information, different types of learning. So here's a little graph that's in this book here, and it basically talks about, if we really truly understand information and be able to process it, we're more likely to retain it and keep it. So it's important that we focus on that as we're teaching our youth. And the idea here is, our goal is, as servants and teachers, is to help them truly understand. So it's not just a matter of just giving knowledge, right? It's to truly understand. We can't make them accept it. This is an internal decision for them, and they will not accept what they can't understand, right? So it's not, again, you're not just giving information. You want to give them information, help them understand it, and hopefully over time they will accept it, and it will become meaningful to them. So in your text, it has a beautiful graph here. So if you could see at the bottom, like I mentioned, the lowest level of learning is knowledge. So you're just conveying knowledge. Okay, then you have comprehension, next level. Then you have application. So comprehension is understanding, application is being able to apply the information, analysis, your ability to break the information down, synthesis, can you create more new information from what you have broken down, and evaluation. Can you say, oh, this information is wrong or right, or there's a problem with this information? So again here, knowledge is the ability to recall facts, comprehension is the ability to interpret them, application is to appreciate the relevance of them, analysis is the ability to break them down, synthesis is the ability to establish a fact from other facts, and evaluation is the ability to assess the accuracy of them. So I got an example here of, for example, you have information, the speed limit sign says 50 kilometers an hour, okay? So knowledge is, yes, I know you know that the speed limit on this road is 50 kilometers an hour. I have a piece of information, okay? Comprehension, you understand that driving faster than 50 kilometers an hour is considered speeding. To apply it is you adjust your speed to stay at or below that. That's how you're applying it in your life. You're gonna lay off the gas a little bit. Analysis is breaking it down into parts. You think about why the limit is over 50, because it's a residential area, there are pedestrians, there are intersections nearby, okay. Synthesis is, okay, you can combine this and say the lower the speed limit is meant to keep people safe. Okay, so now you're breaking it down and applying it to different things, and evaluating, is it reasonable, finally, to be driving under 50 kilometers an hour? Most of the times, it's not reasonable at all. But anyways, we'll leave that for independent opinion. So as mentioned earlier, we'll talk about deep versus surface learning. So if we truly want them to understand, we really want to aim for deep learning, so they're able to really take the information home and apply it in their lives. So we want to really push them towards that. So deep learning, what is it? It attempts to make sense of what is learned. Helps students focus on the overall meaning of the lecture, and it helps students to try to relate their ideas together and construct their own meaning based on experience. Okay, and the results of deep learning are good retention and greater internalization. All right, so we're always trying to strive for that. What is the significance? So people, are often, it's easier just to learn surface meaning, right? Like if you think about it, when the kids are younger, they're memorizing everything. They don't really understand, but they just know what the right answer is. But we always have to push them towards a deep learning, okay? We should always, effective questions focus on explanations and underlying meanings. So as you're asking your youth later on, as you're concluding, what did you learn? How did you learn to apply this? You want to see if they understood the application of what you just taught them, not just that they're reciting you facts, right? And this also helps with their ability to keep this information for long term. Okay, it helps with the long-term retention. Regardless, there might be still times where you'll have to do memorization. I know a lot of Sunday schools like that, and even now. So the text gives some examples of methods of memorization, things that we've all heard of, using acronyms or rhymes, using a picture, an action, or a story. And then we want to talk about making communication moving. So it's actually interesting here. It talks about how you can really allow people or force your youth to really remember, okay, to remember what you're talking about. So here it talks about the brain has two levels of memory, short-term and long-term memory. And studies indicate that the brain does not permanently store every piece of information it receives. Most information goes into short-term and then evaporates, okay, over time. So information that is deemed significant, so stuff that is really important, is what tends to be filed into long-term memory, and it happens in three ways. Okay, I found this interesting. So relevance, is this important? Is this information important to me? Okay, so if it's important to me, I'm going to hang on to it, right? There's a sale at Costco next week is important. I'm going to hang on to this information. I'm going to act on it next week. Okay, so that's called voluntary retention. Reinforcement. So if the information repeated, oftentimes that's how we study, repeating information. Repetitive, that's called repetitive retention. Response. If the information produces a significant emotional response. So, in your lesson, if you say a really emotional story or share somebody's story, share your own story, that's going to create a real emotional response. They're going to leave that really touched by what you just said, okay? And that's called involuntary retention. So you want to remember these tactics to help information stay, okay, with the youth. Memory and the emotions. And again, the text uses a lot of examples when Jesus used emotional situations to create this. So certain emotions that you can use are joy. So having fun in your class, saying a funny story, creating suspense, okay? Creating a story that has suspense to it can really help get them excited and really listen up to what you're about to say. Affection, sadness. Unfortunately, sometimes we all like sad stories. It really helps us remember what we're talking about. And frustration, by having a problem for them to solve, if they really work hard at it and they're really struggling and eventually they get it, that really helps them remember the story. I gave a presentation today, but I only pretended to know what I was talking about. Fortunately, my audience was only pretending to listen. So we want to try to avoid that as much as possible. Okay. So I would like now to split up. It's been about 4, yeah. So I would like us to take some time with this case study. So this is kind of taking the aspects we learned last week and a few things that we learned today. I'm thinking if we could split up into groups of 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let's do 4. We could do groups of 4. There might be one group of 3. And we'll do the following. You can pick the story of the Good Samaritan or the parable of the prodigal son. And then what you will do with this is create a lesson outline. So you want to create a statement of intent, create 2 statements of proposition, create an introduction, or at least the elements that you would use for the introduction, and create a conclusion for that. Okay? Yes. So why don't we could reset again at, let's say, 4:30, but that would include a break, some water or whatever, and then speak. Is that okay? And then we can present. And then after that, the final 2 sessions aren't really that heavily involved. Okay, guys? So we'll meet again at 4:30. Okay. So I'm excited. I'd like to hear what you guys have come up with, the great, amazing ideas to inspire the rest of us. So who would like to begin? All right, go ahead. Okay.
standard. The way that we would approach actually doing this introduction, we would create a scenario, like a story, something that's appropriate for you are friends with someone, and you see that victim alone inside, but you know that they're wrong. You have this time when you don't want to like have a weird relationship with your friend. And so that would set us up to go back questioning that mistake. Do I really love God? How can I overlook someone who needs help? Do I really love my neighbor? And then just go into prayer to ask God, right? And then take some kind of challenge where we for the next week.
Very nice, very nice, very thought provoking, and really getting at it. And especially when you use the bullying example, it's gonna probably hit home, unfortunately, to a lot of people. So that's really gonna get for attention. Very well done. Thank you for sharing, guys. Did you guys want to go? Go ahead. So I mean, you're gonna, yeah.
Oh, I hold it. Okay, it works. Yeah. So I was saying like the statement would be, if you have everything, why?
Mm-hmm. Good. So it's more of a, we spoke about sort of an inductive approach where you allow them to kind of get to the conclusion but you want to lead them to your points. You have a point in mind you want to lead them to. So to answer your question, same intent can't really be a question because it's gotta be, this is what I'm trying to hammer through, right? Very good. Yeah, so if you'll notice in the structure, it doesn't include, I didn't ask for, so you have the preposition and then the elaboration. That's like the meat, I didn't include that just for time purposes. Okay, so that's all those points that you're saying. The themes could go into the meat or elaborating your preposition. Okay, thank you very much. Okay. You see? Yeah, it is dying. I'll do mine. Here you go.
Okay, so we chose the Good Samaritan. And our statement of intent was being a good person when no one's watching. And then our proposition statements, the first one was faith without actions is empty, because the first two people in the story were faithful but didn't do anything, so it didn't matter. And then the second one was the desire to please God is like the only motivating factor for being good and doing all this stuff. So for our introduction, we thought we would go with a question. And we would say, is being Christian enough to get you to heaven? And kind of open that conversation, is it not, you know. And then maybe follow up with kind of like an illustration or a story about someone who maybe isn't Christian or maybe isn't like your best friend, but who went out of their way to do something for someone. And like open up like, what does that mean, things like that. And then for our conclusion, the plan would be like a summary of the story of what the discussion was, and then to go into applications, but applications in like a, how do we show Christ-like kindness in a way that isn't for praise, clicks, recognition, and like discuss that basically.
Last but not least, the gentleman over there. They promised that they have something quite riveting to share with us.
So first we picked the prodigal son, and our statement of intent was basically to teach them like to not despair and to be able to get up after sinning. Or to not despair and to be able to get up after sinning right away. Our statements of proposition are basically that God will always forgive you, and despair is dangerous, hence like the being able to get up quickly after sin.
For the intro, we were thinking of doing like a debate style where we split up the group into two, and then we throw like a morally like kind of gray area situation of whether you should forgive the person or not. Like someone did something that's iffy, and should we forgive them or not? And then we'll have each group debate, like one group debate why you should forgive them, the other group should debate why you shouldn't forgive them. And then yeah, so that's for the intro. And then for the conclusion, we'll just go over through yeah, we'll just hammer the idea that that like to always turn back to God after realizing your sin, and to not fall into despair, because that's something from the devil. Like to not fall into not shame, but feel the guilt.
Very nice, guys. Thank you very much. Yes.
I think the online group did their own.
Okay. That would be great. So how do, okay. Okay. Okay, so from Verena Andrawis here. Statement of intent is to help youth understand the story of the Good Samaritan beyond the idea of simply loving their neighbor, and to challenge them to live it out its deeper lessons by showing compassion and being intentional, even if it's difficult. Proposition 1, showing love through action, not just word. Proposition 2, showing grace to others even when it's uncomfortable for or seems unfair. So introduction would be a relatable question. Have you ever seen someone in need and felt tempted to walk past because you were busy or uncomfortable? Very nice, intriguing question. And conclusion is a takeaway example, a takeaway activity, for example, to look at one moment where we can be a good Samaritan, like at school or at home, and the next week they can share with us. And then loving your neighbor means through mercy action. So encourage listeners to reflect on who they may be overlooking in their own lives. And a question that tends to make for good discussion is, what does someone else's problem become our responsibility? What stops us from helping? That'll be an introduction question. Okay. Thank you very much, guys. Any questions? Like, there might be some questions, but are you starting to see how to, when you're giving a lesson, how to work through it, how you can structure things? Structure is very important, right? Because we all have great ideas in here. And how do we get them out in a way where we can communicate? And we've seen this all the time. We see this a lot of time. A lot of times people go up and they say a lot of great ideas, but nothing is following any example, and you lose track. So I think if we want things to stick, we want to be effective communicators, we have to be able to have a goal and sum everything up in a nice package. So I hope you're able to kind of get a little bit of where you start. When you have a lesson, okay, where do I begin? And then you can go back to this. Okay, what am I going to say? And so on and so forth. Okay. All right, so let's move on. So the next topic is the law of setting. So this talks about the setting of your classroom. And to be honest, you'll notice a lot of things are pretty self-explanatory. It just really forces you to think. If you're sitting in a new classroom, sometimes in Sunday school, you're assigned a classroom at the beginning of the year, and that's typically the classroom for the rest of the year. So you want to look at it and say, how can I optimize things in this classroom? We obviously don't have, a lot of things we can do with it, but just to allow you to think, how can I optimize in the setting of this classroom to kind of optimize the learning experience for everybody. So the three things that the text focuses on is the environment or the room that you're in, the seating type, and the resources. So the size of the room, obviously, it can either be too big or too small. If it's too small, there's really not much you can do about that. But if it's too large, for example, if it's like this, maybe have readjust the orientation of the room. One example that they give here is using this diagram. So if the room is too large, then bring everybody closer, maybe have some partitions if possible. But it's important to do that. Even myself, when I'm asked to give talks to servants, everybody's scattered all the way down. It doesn't, like, you're kind of yelling across. And then you tell people to move up, and everyone's like reluctant to move up. But it's important to get everybody closer to each other, so that you can create an environment where you're not yelling and everyone's listening, productively. Talks about decor. If the room is too messy, tidy it up a little bit. If it's plain or too dry, maybe add some pictures. Have some, if there's some activities that you've done with your Sunday school class throughout your youth group class throughout the year, not a bad idea to put it up. Hopefully it lasts for the following week. So a few things you want to keep in mind. And again, a lot of these, tips are, you might be able to apply them in the youth service today, or you might be able to apply them to other aspects if you're going to be in charge of a lesson in somewhere else. So you can really take these examples to where you're going. talks about having a room that's familiar, a familiar room. So oftentimes having the same room every time is a good thing. People associate positive memories with that room. It becomes comfortable. Everyone's going to have their spot in the room. They're going to go to their corner, and that's good. Oftentimes, changing things up might spice up the lesson a little bit, might make things a little bit more intriguing or exciting. The author advises to, have a discussion with your youth. See, hey, do we want to change it up a little bit? Do we want to go, somewhere else to have the lesson? If the nice weather's outside, do we want to just go outside on the field and have our lesson? To change things up a little bit, it might add a little bit of an element of excitement. Temperature. I think people always have debates about this. If it's too cold or too hot, just you can assess that as you go. It's also about lighting, using lighting. If it's an intimate Bible study, maybe dimming down the lights a little bit might create a more intimate, more relaxed environment. If it's a speaker with a large group, lighting is important, especially if there's a lot of people. Having lighting directed at a speaker can be helpful so they could see expressions and so on and so forth. Yeah, and basically he talks about those things in here. Distractions is a good one. First thing that comes to mind in our Sunday school room is that little glass window where people come by and they knock and they run off. So you want to be aware of that. Keep people sitting away from the glass or from the clear glass as much as possible if there's students running through the hallways. So keep that in mind. There's certain things that you can do that are in your control, obviously. So keep an ear out for them and try to affect those changes as much as possible. Talks a little bit about seating and seating arrangements. Okay, so you'll find that in your classroom you have the option to have different seating arrangements depending on how you want to speak. So having a straight line seating where the leader is facing the group, so it allows everybody focusing on the teacher or on the leader. So that depending on the type of lesson that you're going to have, that can be very important. But does not necessarily encourage interaction, right? So if they're all sitting in one line, they can't really all speak to each other. They can't see each other's facial expressions. So you got to say, okay, are we going to have a group discussion today? You want people to share a lot of thoughts as they're talking. So and therefore you adjust the seating accordingly. If you're going to have a lot of discussion, maybe a semicircle is a good way of doing things. So you can kind of allow them to see each other, right? See each other's facial expressions, be able to speak to each other. And this is a nice way because the leader is still able to see everybody, and they're able to see each other as well. The circle, so having a full circle is another way of getting the whole group to participate, but keep in mind that you as a leader, you're always going to have people behind you. Okay, so it may not always be 100% effective that way. So, and you won't be able to maintain eye contact with everybody all the time, right? Because there's always going to be people who can't see you. So you want to keep that in mind. The author talks about the cafe sort of arrangement where everybody's sitting on chairs with round tables. And especially if you're going to have a lot of discussions and Bible studies where there's a lot of writing down and that sort of thing, that can be very helpful, obviously. Talks a little bit about seating levels. So, having higher position than your audience, obviously you're projecting some sort of authority, you're looking down on them. It tends to be better in public settings where everybody wants to see the speaker, see their facial expressions. So in that case, you think of a sermon, for example, and that sort of thing. So in those scenarios, it can be quite helpful. However, if you want to have an environment of equality or intimate atmosphere, obviously, it's gonna play away from that. Talks about having a lower seating position than everybody else, so you think sort of a of a lecture style, and equal. So I think equal, is probably the one that we're most commonly going to be interacting with, especially on a Sunday school or a youth group service level. And that, you're able, by sitting equally with the youth, you're able to convey a intimacy. It will allow them to kind of have equality among the participants, so everybody can kind of participate equally. talks a little bit about seating types, very specific. So, obviously having a straight back chair, people are going to be up, alert, hopefully ready to listen. Those are the ones that tend to be in our, in our Sunday school rooms, versus having a comfortable couch. If you want them to nap, there's a risk of napping maybe sometimes, but if you want a more comfortable environment, people, if they're more comfortable, sometimes they're just more able to divulge information and enter into Bible or situations or discussions that are more intimate. So you want to keep that in mind. Talks about sitting on the floor, or sitting or lying on the floor is also another way that you can create an intimate environment, or sitting around a table, especially if there's, again, pen and paper involved. Seating positions, you'll find that sometimes you have to use this. So most of the time, the youth are sitting in front of you, so you have direct eye contact with them and you know what's happening, and encourage them to participate. But sometimes if somebody is speaking or misbehaving, then you get them to sit right next to you, so you have direct control of them. So keep in mind, you have control that way as well. And a lot of things that are really pretty intuitive here. The value of using a microphone. I know a lot of times it's uncomfortable for us to use a microphone, but it's sometimes, he advises here that, especially in groups of 50 or more, using a microphone is important and needed. So you might be uncomfortable with it, but it is something that is important. It talks about different types of microphones, having a lapel microphone, and if you're comfortable, or having a handheld microphone. He says that having a handheld microphone sometimes allows you to project your voice differently. So you want to just keep that in mind. Talking about different platforms. So if you're, again, this more applies if you're going to give a talk for a larger amount of people. Having a pulpit or a lectern, sometimes you notice a lot of speakers, even sermons or priests who like to speak, some like to be behind and others like to be out, right? Like I'm standing here, I don't like this in front of me. So a lot of times you'll find that you want to see, is the pulpit or lectern, is it creating a barrier? You're not able to express yourself properly. So you want to keep that in mind. So, oftentimes it specifically says to put it on an angle if you still have papers or books. So techniques to keep in mind if you're ever put in these situations. Using projectors, obviously we're all familiar with that, and the ability to enhance your presentation using multimedia. This is a very important tip. I want you all, if anything you're going to go home with, he was told to keep his presentation interesting, so he asked, how do you program a projector to explode? So just be careful when you use these, a lot of fireworks in your... Nobody else found that funny? Okay. So the final law, and I thank you for bearing with me here. This is our final law here, the law of speech. Creating a presentation that is engaging and effective. You need to make better your method of talking. Do you mean I need to improve my communication skills? So basically the idea here is we want to talk about the ability of the communicator to present content effectively. So great content, you have your content, you worked hard at it, you have great structure, you have a lot of substance, but it still doesn't guarantee good communication. So the last point of the good communication here is your ability to actually speak. And it's very important to note that not everybody's a gifted speaker, right? But we all need to work on it, right? So you want to keep that in mind. Everybody has a different baseline, but there's always room for improvement and always room to be able to improve on our ability to speak. So a couple of some nice, helpful tips here is how to, overcome nervousness. Public speaking is cited as the #1 fear for a lot of people. So everybody is afraid of speaking publicly. This is a normal thing. So what are some tips that we can, use to overcome that? And he says, really, we have a lot of tips here, but the #1 thing is experience. And it is really true. The more you practice, the more you do it, the more your nervousness will go away. It's absolutely 100% true. So you want to keep that in mind. So the first step, he says, is to prepare your content well. The more confident you are about your content, the more you've practiced, that's going to really be the number one thing that's going to help you to overcome nervousness. And then, so if you're still nervous, then what do? It says identify your fear and label it, right? So if you're worried that you're going to forget something or go blank, well, practice your topic. If you're worried, for example, that your mouth will go dry, keep some water with you, take sips of water before. So really try to identify what's really making you nervous, and try to find a resolution. And then practice. Practice makes perfect, as they say, so that watch what you eat and drink. So try not to have the biggest meal of the day right before you give a talk or give the lesson, so you want to keep that in mind. For most moments right before, you want to get up slowly. A lot of times people get up and they rush up and they start talking. Go slowly, take deep breaths. I know this all sounds really natural, like it makes sense, which it does, but a lot of times out of our nervousness, we forget about it. So really go extra slow. If you think you're going slow in your head, go extra slow, because in your head, you're probably going faster than what you think. Okay, when you stand up to speak, walk slowly to the front and continue to breathe deeply. Sorry. A few tips when you're speaking and the kind of words that you're using. Try to avoid any unnecessary words, right? Try to be succinct in your communication. Try to minimize meaningless words, saying things like stuff and things, the things that I just said. I just said things. Filler words like and I know I have that tendency. Try to be succinct and as productive in the terminology and the words that you use as much as possible. Try to minimize using Christian jargon. Difficult words, I really like that one. I think a lot of times we think that we want to sound more complicated than we are, or we're going to impress people by using more difficult words. But oftentimes using complicated words just turns people off, right? People just don't, they stop following. So, keep that in mind. Poor grammar, you want to, try to always continually work on your grammar. So the 5 essentials for voice presentation. So this actually has to deal with physically speaking. So pitch. So pitch is how high and how low you go, right? So the first person that comes to mind, pitch, is Abu Anthony Masih. Anybody hear any of his sermons, right? He knows how to speak very high and he gets very low, right? He varies his pitch a lot. So you want to, alter the pitch as you go. It creates excitement, it creates variance, keeps things exciting a little bit. Pace, are you speaking very hard or very quickly so nobody can understand? Or you want to speak slow to really emphasize certain things. So remember those things as you're talking. Remember to use pause. I know one of the things that I used to do sometimes when I've been asked to give sermons is that I run through the points. My wife is like, why don't you just pause after you finish a point before you go on to the next? So pause, allow people to absorb things, and then you can go on to the next point. Having punch or a loud exclamation commands attention. Sorry, yeah. And power, your ability to project. Obviously, everybody has different strengths in their voice. We can all improve on power. One tip is speaking from the bottom of your lungs here as opposed to speaking from your throat. So you want to keep in mind if you have a weaker voice, power is important, and it's something that you can work on and improve to the maximum of your ability, obviously. Passion. Having passion is more of a reality than a technique. So the more you're familiar with your topic, the more you're experienced with your topic, the passion is just going to come out in how you speak. So making the right gestures. So it's important that, especially if it's early on that we're really working on our craft and giving lessons, is to be aware of any gestures we might be giving off that might be causing a distraction, okay? And you can often get that sort of feedback from other servants who are with you, or if there's somebody who's mentoring you, get their sort of advice on any gestures that you're doing. So oftentimes, if we're nervous, we might be doing a gesture that we're not aware of. Okay, so you want to keep that in mind and try to make the gestures as natural as possible. We all have gestures, but they have to be natural and part of our, our normal course as much as possible. So they should be spontaneous, so natural. They should not. They should be varied. Okay, so you don't want to doing the same gesture all the time. It's not gonna become a gesture anymore, right? It's gonna become a little bit of an annoying, and it shouldn't be distracting. So this is an example of what you don't want to be. Okay, I'm not an expert on body language, but I get the feeling you're not being totally honest with me, right? So these are the type of gestures you want to avoid. Remember eye contact, okay? People don't trust people who don't make eye contact sometimes, right? So, if you're looking up there and you're talking, no one, you're just not gonna connect with anybody, right? You don't wanna be staring people down either and focusing on people. You wanna graze the room left and right, okay? Maybe focus on the forehead, get into the eyes, left and right, okay? As opposed to speaking like that, obviously, that's not gonna be effective. Facial expressions can enhance what you say. Sorry. Oh, sorry, guys. 1 second here. Oh. Sorry, I am way past where I should be here. I apologize. Give me 1 second. There we go. Sorry. Going back, body language, using facial expressions, using a smile. There's a power in using smiles sometimes. So don't forget about that. That really helps warm up your message and really attract some nice attention. Watch your posture. You don't want to be slouching over the lectern there. Watch your posture as you're presenting. And then talking about using different resources. So a lot of these we obviously know, but don't forget that to incorporate them. Okay, so videos, usually a visual Bible. I know way back when I used to serve, I found this website called WinClips where they had like Christian movie clips to illustrate certain themes, biblical themes or verses. So vary things up using different audiovisual resources. It doesn't have to be every time you present something like this. It doesn't have to include that, but just to vary it up. Audio, using a nice song, for example, the example that I mentioned to you guys earlier. Using handouts and whiteboards. It's also, you can incorporate that into your lessons. Slides, posters, exhibits, demonstrations. Pretty self-explanatory items. Resources for creativity can include stationery, colored paper, and cardboard, drawing, sculptures. If you really want to jazz things up and make things super interesting. I know a lot of these sometimes maybe using crafts for the younger kids, they're very good at doing crafts, but sometimes if you can get creative, you can use it in the older youth as well. When you have your visual resources, don't just assume everybody can see it, that you're just going to project it. So do a test. Is it very clear? Can it be seen by everyone? Just do a little bit of, take a minute there to evaluate it. If people are in a corner, can't see it, tell them to gather in. Are the words large enough for all to read? So as you're preparing your slide, I admit I feel my slides are probably a bit too full sometimes. I think they should be a little bit more abbreviated. So, keep that in mind as you're preparing certain I know when you walk away from a lesson, you've had the most interaction in that lesson, you've had the most students say their opinion and talk and debate, especially when we have heated debates. That's when you really feel that, yeah, they really digested this topic. This is, you know, they're really gonna take something home. So it's really important that as a counselor, especially when they're in a group Bible study or a discussion, that we encourage interaction. This is an important tip. So the main aim of the leader is to gradually move into the background. Okay, so that the group is interacting with each other. All right. So what do they mean by that? So this example kind of this diagram explains. So figure eight is, you know, the leader is in control. You're kind of telling who's going to talk, who's not. But ideally, you want to get into a situation where, you know, in an organized way, obviously, everybody's interacting with each other. Okay, the flow of the discussion is kind of going on its own. That's when you really know everyone is engaged and everybody is interactive. So what are some strategies for that? Do not ask closed-ended questions. And we spoke about questions earlier. So if you ask a closed-ended question, it's going to be yes or no, and then that's it, right? There's nothing else to ask. So ask in questions, you know, that encourage people to share their opinions. Do not make comments about each person's answers. Okay, so the emphasis here is each. So every time somebody says something, you don't always have to, as a leader, make a comment about them. You'll establish a pattern that they're always waiting for you to say something, right? Like every time somebody says something, they're always waiting for my interaction. But instead, do encourage others to respond. You know, that was an interesting thought. What does everybody think about what, you know, so and so said? That's how you get people to interact, right? If you're always making the comment, then again, it always comes back to you. But instead, you want it to be going around. Do not answer your own questions. This is a nice tip, right? So if you answer the question and you wait a little bit, sorry, if you ask a question, you wait a little bit and then you answer it. Well, everyone knows he's eventually going to answer it, so I'm just going to sit quiet, right? But instead, rephrase the question, right? Rephrase it and tell, you know, eventually people are going to answer, right? And the idea is you want them to answer your question. Well, Think we should be good now? Okay. Okay. Sorry, I don't know. All right, guys, give me 1 second here. All right, we're gonna. Yeah. So again, going back to asking questions. So try to, if nobody's interacting, just rephrase your question. Eventually, people will answer. This is an important tip that I struggle with sometimes. Don't be afraid of silence in the room. So when you ask the question and the crowd goes quiet, it's okay. Let them be quiet. Allow them to think. Most people need time to think to formulate a good answer. So remember that people think best during silence. All right. So and then maybe reflecting on things they're going to say. So you want to keep that in mind. Don't impose your views on the group. It's very important that you're respectful of other people's opinions and affirm what they have to say, because people might be sort of intimidated by if they know you're very clear about a certain thing, or you have very opinionated about a certain topic. They might be shy about expressing themselves. So always, affirm other people's opinions and create a positive environment to allow them to continue to express their opinion. And the final goal is creating equality in a group discussion, right? And so it's very often do people want to sit through something without having anything to say, all right? Most people want to contribute somehow. And so the main aim of the leader, the aim of the leader is to help each person have a significant contribution to the group that they feel equally satisfied with. Okay? The key thing is here is that equality is not the same as sharing equally. Okay, so what do we mean by that? So for the quieter person, they might just need to chime in a few times versus somebody who's a little bit more vocal and has a lot to say. But they both derive the same amount from the talk, right? They both derive the same amount of benefit from your group discussion. So you want to keep that in mind. So one strategy is encouraging the quieter ones to contribute. Okay, and this is always going to be a challenge, right? Like there's always going to be quieter, shyer students you have in your class, always, regardless of which gender. And so it's important to always, encourage them. So what are some good tips that we can do that? So try to involve them earlier on in the discussion, and the author calls this breaking the sound barrier, right? So by asking simple questions, like not right or wrong questions, that are opinionated related questions, there's no right or wrong, open-ended questions, it can really allow them just to say something. All it takes for them is just to say something in a group, and after that, their confidence, you'll see, will skyrocket. And a way, one tip he advises is, let's say you have the same question for the whole class, and the quiet person is sitting on this end, then you start from the other side, right? Slowly working your way. Or if you're going to pick people like in a random order, to pick them last. Once they've heard other people speak, they've had a chance to build up their confidence to say what they're saying. So some tips to encourage that. Give them time to think. Okay, again, we're talking about the individuals who are shy. Never, ever put them on the spot. Okay, that's not going to impair. All right, that probably might take them the other way. I know there's that tendency to do that. So never put somebody on the spot. And again, ask for opinions, not facts. So that helps with minimizing their ability of being wrong. If you ask a fact, there's a risk of it being wrong, and you kind of how to address that. For example, he gives an example. What are some of the most common temptations we face today? That's a pretty open-ended, non-factual type of question. And another nice tip that he gives here is to affirm, when that shy person finally speaks, affirm what they just said. Great, but at the same time, don't go over the top. Bravo, like don't make a big deal out of it. Like they're going to know what you're trying to do. So you want to affirm them gently as opposed to being quiet. If you go quiet, they might feel that, oh, you think what they said is wrong. Okay. But at the same time, you don't want to go over the top either. All right. So don't greet their contribution with silence, or they might interpret it with a lack of response and disapproval. So be a little bit careful with them until you kind of build a rapport. Now, what do you do with the talkative ones, right? So you have the quiet ones, you have talkative ones in your class. They're gonna sort of participate on their own, volition. So oftentimes, and one tip it says in there is that oftentimes they don't realize how talkative they are. They may have been told growing up, but they don't realize that they're maybe taking over the class, and it's not something they're doing intentionally or for any other reason. That's just the personality type. So one tip is, to direct questions away from them, right? So you don't, in a polite way, you don't, let's say, don't not necessarily make eye contact directly with them. You may, if you want to, for example, target that room, the talkative person is sitting there, you direct questions away from them to get other people involved. Obviously, you're not singling them out, but you want to get everybody else involved before you eventually go to them. Invite others to, say or contribute to what they just said. So if that talkative person just said something, so-and-so, what are your thoughts, or what do you guys think about what Mary just said? And that allows that person to kind of stop talking a little bit and allow for interaction from other people. And finally, perhaps, outside of group time or after class, you affirm to that talkative person, say, hey, I really appreciate all the input. You're very valuable. But tell them that you're really working on, trying to get others involved in the group. So keep that open dialogue with them, just in case they start to feel some sort of pattern or anything like that. And I think, that should help resolve the issue for the most part. And that is all I have for this course, guys. Thank you so much. Any questions? I know there's a lot of information, a lot of stuff being thrown out there, but I really hope, especially with the activity we did today, it kind of really got you to focus on sort of how to structure things. At the end of the day, the whole point of this, the whole goal of this is being able to deliver something that's effective for the youth. And at least now you have some sort of guide or where to start. It's a work in progress. You're always going to find yourself. You're going to start somewhere, continue to improve, but at least now you have a starting point. Any questions, guys? Comments, concerns? No? Okay. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much.
Okay, so just a comment, especially the communication part of this course is gonna be examined in the practical when you guys do the presentation of the class or lesson in the class. You will be evaluated against the 10 the laws of the speaker, laws of the audience, and the laws of the setting and stuff like that. So it will be evaluated according to this routine. Okay?
Thank you.